30 minutes, 40 aircraft, and nobody stopped it. Hold those three facts simultaneously before we go any further. Not as numbers, as a reality that rewrote the strategic map of the Middle East between 2:17 and 2:47 in the morning while most of the world was asleep. I have spent my career studying systems, how they are built, how they calcify, how they develop absolute confidence in their own assumptions at precisely the moment those assumptions become most dangerous. What I watched unfold over the Negev desert last night is not a military story. It is a story about what happens when a system stops being able to see the questions it was never designed to ask. The Fath-360, a weapon that the Western defense establishment cataloged, assessed, and filed under the heading of regional tactical nuisance, a short-range system, a propaganda piece, something to be intercepted, neutralized, managed. Last night, that dismissal cost Israel its entire forward airstrike capability in a single operational window. 40 F-35I Adir aircraft, the crown jewel of Israeli air superiority, each worth over $100 million, were destroyed on the ground before a single pilot could reach a cockpit. $4 billion in American-built aerospace technology vaporized in darkness, not by a peer military with aircraft carriers and satellite constellations, by Iran, by a nation that Washington has spent 5 decades trying to strangle through sanctions, covert operations, and relentless diplomatic pressure. That is the detail that stops me, not the destruction itself, the dismissal that made the destruction possible. Nevatim airbase is not simply an airfield. It is the operational heart of Israeli air dominance across the entire region. Every major Israeli airstrike against Iranian assets in Syria originated from Nevatim. Every deep strike mission against Hezbollah's precision missile manufacturing infrastructure. Every covert penetration of defended airspace. Destroying Nevatim's flight line is not merely destroying aircraft. It is destroying Israel's ability to project offensive power across the entire regional chessboard simultaneously. Iran understood this with absolute clarity. The targeting logic behind last night's operation was the product of years of intelligence collection, operational planning, and patient preparation for exactly this moment. Age 9 and 17 in the morning, and that timing was itself a deliberate calculation. Israeli air defense crews were at their lowest alert readiness. The watch rotation had just changed. Processing speed at radar stations was at its overnight minimum. Iranian operational planners selected the launch window based on detailed knowledge of Israeli defense cycle patterns, knowledge accumulated through years of electronic intelligence collection, drone overflights, and human intelligence networks that Western analysts consistently underestimated. The system had been studied, its rhythms had been mapped, its vulnerabilities had been cataloged with the patience of someone who understands that the best time to test a defense is when the defenders believe nothing is coming. The opening phase involved a wave of decoy UAVs that flooded the radar environment with targets simultaneously. Israeli air defense networks were suddenly processing hundreds of incoming signatures from multiple approach vectors. The computer systems managing Iron Dome battery allocation and David's Sling intercept assignment were thrown into saturation paralysis. Every battery began cycling through target assignment sequences faster than its reload capacity could support. While every available interceptor was being committed to the decoy wave, the Fath-360 salvos were already airborne from launch positions in western Iran and from mobile platforms pre-positioned through Iraqi territory at approach angles that Israeli early warning arrays were not oriented to cover. The missiles arrived in groups of 8 to 12, targeted against specific hardened shelters within the Nevatim complex. The timing compression between the first impact and the last was under 4 minutes. The base's internal alert system was still processing the initial warning when the second and third salvos were already in terminal descent. Simultaneously, a parallel strike package hit Ramon Air Base in the southern Negev, where Israel had pre-positioned a reserve contingent of F-35s as a dispersal measure. The fact that Iran knew about this dispersal, knew the precise locations within Ramon where the aircraft had been relocated, represents an intelligence penetration of Israeli operational security at a depth that no official source has publicly acknowledged. The impact craters tell the story the press releases do not. By 2:47, 30 minutes after the first launch detection, the assessment reaching IDF Air Force headquarters contained numbers that commanders initially refused to believe. 40 aircraft confirmed destroyed or critically damaged. 3 hardened shelter complexes at Nevatim structurally compromised. The primary fuel and munition storage node hit and burning. Israel's offensive air capability had been effectively neutralized in a single half-hour window. In the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel destroyed the Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian air forces in approximately 3 hours. Last night, Iran executed the functional equivalent in 30 minutes, with ballistic missiles from over 1,000 kilometers, against an adversary on elevated alert that had every reason to expect a major Iranian response. Israel was expecting something, and it still could not stop this. Now I want to take you inside the weapon. Because understanding the Fath-360 is understanding why every assumption that Israel's defense architecture was built upon became, in a single night, a liability rather than a protection. The terminal guidance system is where the Fath-360 separates itself from every previous generation of Iranian ballistic weapons. Conventional ballistic missiles follow a predictable trajectory. They can be tracked. Their impact point can be calculated with sufficient accuracy to assign an intercept solution. This is the foundational assumption on which every component of Israel's layered defense architecture was designed. The Fath-360 invalidates that assumption in its final phase of flight. As the missile descends, an onboard guidance system combining inertial navigation with an electro-optical terminal seeker and a radar altimeter activates and begins comparing the ground signature beneath the missile against a preloaded digital target model. It is not following GPS coordinates. It is looking at the ground, identifying specific structures, and steering itself toward a designated point on a specific building. And because the system is no longer dependent on GPS in its final guidance phase, GPS jamming has zero effect. It navigates by sight. Sight cannot be jammed. This explains two things simultaneously. It explains the extraordinary accuracy of last night's strikes, with impacts clustered within specific shelter bays rather than distributed across the general base area. Missiles were not hitting the runway. They were hitting the exact coordinates where F-35s were parked. And it explains why American GPS jamming operations, running continuously across the region for weeks, produced no meaningful degradation in Iranian strike accuracy. The countermeasure had already been architected around. The salvo employment doctrine compounds the challenge. Iran was not firing single missiles at defended targets. Iran was firing salvos of 8 to 12 missiles against each aim point, compressed into a launch window of under 90 seconds, with multiple batteries targeting the same facilities from different approach vectors simultaneously. Against 8 missiles arriving from 2 approach angles within 30 seconds, a point defense battery faces a mathematics problem with no good solution. It can engage some incoming weapons. It cannot engage all of them. Iran's targeting teams calculated the intercept capacity of each Israeli defense battery, designed salvo sizes and timing to exceed that capacity by a defined margin, and built an operational doctrine around the answer to one precise engineering question. What does a salvo need to look like to guarantee that at least one missile gets through? Every component of the Fath-360 was developed and produced entirely within Iran. The sanctions architecture Washington constructed to prevent exactly this kind of capability has failed completely. What the sanctions actually produced is an Iranian defense industrial base that is now more self-sufficient and more capable than it would have been if Iran had been allowed to purchase weapons freely on the international market. Isolation forced innovation. Necessity produced engineering solutions that imported systems would never have generated because purchased systems do not require the buyer to understand them at the level required to build from first principles. Iran built the Fath-360 from first principles. That is why it performs the way it performs. Within hours of the strikes, the White House Situation Room was operating at maximum density. The National Security Council convened. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs was on secure video link with CENTCOM. And from all of that frantic activity, what emerged publicly was a statement calling on all parties to exercise restraint. Restraint. The word landed in Tel Aviv like a second strike. The standard American response playbook involves 4 steps. Demonstrate air power presence. Present a credible retaliation threat. Use that threat through diplomatic back channels. Execute precision strikes if diplomacy fails. Every step now faces a complication that did not exist 48 hours ago. Carrier groups have been repositioned away from the Gulf of Oman following the demonstration of Iranian anti-ship capability, meaning American carrier aviation is operating from standoff distances that reduce strike tempo significantly. Iran's decision to execute last night's strike reflects a leadership calculation that American retaliation will be constrained by exactly the factors now visibly constraining it. Tehran does not believe the threat is unlimited, and Tehran's behavior is the clearest signal that this assessment is correct. Iran this morning controls the momentum. A diplomatic back channel requires a partner motivated to negotiate. A boss fight for Chines. Iran is not that partner today. Israel has lost 40 F-35s. The United States Air Force's total F-35A inventory globally is approximately 450 aircraft. Transferring replacements at the speed the situation demands would require pulling from active operational squadrons, reducing American air combat capability in other theaters. The production rate of new F-35s cannot fill a 40 aircraft gap in anything less than several years. And there is a question no one in official Washington will ask publicly, but every analyst is asking privately. If Nevatim can be struck with this accuracy and density, what does that imply about the vulnerability of American air bases in the region? Al-Udeid in Qatar, Al-Dhafra in the UAE, Incirlik in Turkey. Conventional air bases operating in the open with known coordinates against an adversary that just demonstrated it can hit a specific aircraft shelter bay at over 1,000 kilometers range. The silence from the Pentagon on this question is itself an answer. For 75 years, Israeli security doctrine has rested on absolute air supremacy, the ability to strike anywhere in the region at any time with precision and impunity. This is not merely a military capability. It is the psychological foundation of Israeli deterrence. Last night, that foundation was struck at its base. 40 F-35s destroyed represents approximately 60% of Israel's operational Adir fleet. The aircraft that remain, dispersed to civilian airports and secondary military facilities, are operating under the constant threat of a follow-on strike against those dispersal locations. Every hour that passes without a follow-on strike is an hour Iran is choosing not to strike. Iran controls the tempo of what happens next. The cascading operational consequences reach every theater. Gaza operations conducted with a fraction of available aircraft. The northern front with Hezbollah fundamentally changed overnight. Syria, effectively a closed theater for Israeli air activity. The economic damage compounds the military, $4 billion in direct hardware loss against an annual defense budget of approximately $24 billion, with no mechanism for rapid replacement and no insurance framework that operates at this scale. Pull back and look at what last night means for the global system. The post-Cold War Middle Eastern order was built on the assumption that American military primacy was unchallengeable and Israeli qualitative military edge was permanent. Iran rejected that framework. For 45 years, Iran absorbed the maximum pressure the most powerful nation in human history could generate. And last night, Iran destroyed 60% of the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built at the most heavily defended military installation in the Middle East. Russia observes with satisfaction it does not conceal. China watches as long-term validation its own precision ballistic missile capabilities designed to deny American carrier operations in the Western Pacific just watched a smaller-scale version of the same strategy succeed in a live operational environment. The Gulf monarchies are reassessing the guarantees their security architecture was built upon. Here is what I want you to understand, because this is where everything I have spent my career studying converges with what I am watching in real time. A system that dismisses what it does not understand will eventually be defeated by it. The Fath-360 was dismissed, cataloged and filed and largely forgotten by the analytical community that should have been asking harder questions about what Iran was building in the spaces Western surveillance was not looking. The weapon nobody took seriously just ended 75 years of Israeli air supremacy. The missile called a propaganda piece just destroyed $4 billion of the most advanced military technology America has ever produced. I have watched this pattern in every institution I have studied. The threat that gets dismissed is always the one the existing framework was not designed to detect. Not because the people inside the framework are incompetent, because frameworks by their nature optimize for the threats they were built to address and systematically underweight the threats they were not. The more confident a system becomes in its own architecture, the more completely it loses the capacity to see the questions its architecture cannot answer. The Fath-360 was precisely the question that Israel's defense architecture was not designed to answer. 8 to 12 missiles, 2 approach vectors, 90-second launch window. The mathematics of that problem had no solution inside the existing system. Not because the system was poorly designed, because it was designed for a different problem entirely. What happened last night was not simply a military engagement. It was a historical sentence written in fire across the Negev desert, declaring that the old assumptions of the Middle Eastern power game have been permanently replaced. Iran's Fath-360 did not merely destroy 40 aircraft. It destroyed the assumption of Israeli air invincibility. It destroyed the credibility of American deterrence in its current form. It destroyed the comfortable certainty that technological superiority and alliance backing guarantee security against a determined, self-reliant adversary that has spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. Israel wakes up this morning without an offensive air force. Washington wakes up without a clear military option that does not carry catastrophic escalation risk. And Tehran wakes up having demonstrated to every government on earth that genuine strategic self-reliance is not just a principle, it is a capability. And last night it worked. What is your assessment? Can Israel reconstitute its air power fast enough to matter? Does Washington have a realistic option the playbook has not already exhausted? Leave your analysis in the comments. Share this with everyone serious about understanding what is actually unfolding. Subscribe, because in a world this dangerous, analysis that cuts through the noise is not optional. It is necessary. Stay sharp, stay questioning, and never stop asking the questions the system was not designed to answer.